which things are moving much too slowly to see these, and things are moving too complicatedly to see them. But stand off at a distance, as it were, and you would see the same rhythms occurring again and again and again and again, so that they would appear from that distance, or from time that speeded up, to be simply continuity, like the continuity from here to here, which looked at closely is full of space. So you would get what we call in naive language the reincarnation of forms. You, considered as this kind of a wiggle that is recognizable as me, would happen again and again and again, with no spook traveling from one happening to the next. That wouldn't be necessary any more than it's necessary to have a line joining one dot in the press photograph with another dot, so that they will make continuous sense at a different level. You know, when you watch television, you're actually watching a moving dot. It moves so fast that it creates the image. Now let's supposing you had a different kind of eye altogether that had no memory in it. You would look at the television screen and you would see this dot dancing all across and leaving no trace. You say, what kind of a funny thing is that? Oh, it doesn't make any sense. But seen in another way, you see, all that picture makes sense. So you see, you don't have to, all these mysteries, like our reincarnation, you don't need any spooky knowledge to understand them. It's all right out in front of you, and you will discover that as I talk to you, I'm not going to tell you a thing that you didn't already know. All this was plain to you. All I will do is put it in words in such a way that you will be able to say, well, that's what I always thought, but I could never explain it. Yesterday I talked to you about the three basic principles of Taoist philosophy, namely Tao itself, the course of nature, Wu Wei, not forcing, in other words, the watercourse character of the course of nature, and third, De, which is virtue, or the seemingly magical power which comes of following the watercourse, of taking the line of least resistance, which argues always a high order of intelligence, because it's more intelligent to sail a boat than to row, even though it's a lazier way of doing it. Use the wind, use it's like in the same way for technology. We haven't really woken up to the fact that it would be much more intelligent to use the sun, the wind, and the tides as a source of energy rather than fossil fuel. But once again, to understand anything about this philosophy, you really need to be in a state of wise ignorance. I am often cast among people who are frantically conceptualizing and defending their frameworks of conceptualization, who have a very fixed, elaborate theory of the nature of the universe and of man's destiny and of the way to its fulfillment. And you will find, too, that these conceptions of man's destiny are very ambitious. But once you're in that framework of conceptualization, you become increasingly abstracted from the natural world, as if you were a person who lives in books rather than in life, or lives in the movies rather than with people. Because you begin to fall into the fundamental fallacy of civilization, which is to value the world of symbol above the world which symbols represent. And of course, we in our culture have taken that to the wildest extremes, so that you don't exist unless you possess a birth certificate or a passport, which is a piece of paper. So that the record of what happens is far more important than what happens. Therefore, we waste incalculable energy on recording, on filling out income tax forms, on seeing that in a university the registrar's records are properly protected. The books in the library can go to hell, but they keep safes for the students' records. And so in the same way, a lot of people don't believe that they are real unless they can read about themselves in the newspaper. And a lot of people feel uncomfortable if something fantastic occurs and there's nobody there with a camera to take a picture of it. And so children commit crimes in order to get their names in the newspaper, so that they know they're there, because their parents all the time are using appearance in the newspaper as a standard of importance. And so obviously you are not important unless you too appear in the newspaper, in the record. You will go down to history. And so too we are making records on films and all sorts of tapes of what we call vanishing civilizations, vanishing cultures, vanishing arts, vanishing species. And we seem to think, well, it's all right, they can vanish just so long as we have them recorded. You know, there aren't any whales anymore, but you can read about them in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And this confusion of the world of representations with the world of nature is just disastrous. So therefore, it's tremendously important for us to get back to the world of nature. You may have a concept that the world of nature is unspiritual. A lot of people do. And a lot of people are at odds with their bodies. But what they are at odds with, really, as I think I tried to point out yesterday, is not this, but their idea of this. A lot of people resent physical change. They resent the idea of the dissolution process that is involved in physical change, that you get older, and that therefore from a conceptual point of view you get uglier. And that just isn't true. If you are alive and alert, old people are not ugly at all, just by virtue of being old. Only, you see, we have very, very rigid concepts of wherein physical beauty consists. So it's important to abandon those ideas, at least occasionally. Because if you are very attached to them, you can always take them up again later. But you see, if you think all the time, it's like talking all the time. I am found by you as a very talkative person, but I assure you that I'm a good listener. In social gatherings, I'll often hold the floor only because somebody hasn't yet produced something more interesting. And the minute somebody does, I'm very silent and attentive, because if I talk all the time, I won't hear what anyone else has to say. Likewise, if I think all the time, I won't have anything to think about except thoughts. And that leaves me high and dry. I become like a library where all the books that are constantly added to it are about the books already in it. And that is pretty much what our big libraries are doing. So it would be as if a painter never saw anything but art galleries. As if a musician listened to nothing but concerts. And so, very simply, this is being out of touch with the world that is naturally with us. I won't even say presented to our senses. That is too conceptual. Lao Tzu said, "The 5 colors make a man blind. The 5 tones make a man deaf." Because if you think there are only 5 colors, you're blind. And if you think there are only 5 tones, you're deaf. There is, as we know, an infinite continuum of sound and color. And the spectrum is merely a matter of convenience in classification. So, likewise, when you read in ancient texts of mysticism that it's necessary to go beyond the senses, that's very easily misunderstood. It is not so much the senses, that is to say the eyes, the ears, etc., which falsify. It's our conceptions of what the eyes and the ears bring to us. In other words, it is not the percept but the concept, wherein we find the root of Maya, illusion, or of course magic, because you can use conceptualization creatively if you know what you're doing. That's very important. But if you don't know what you're doing, your concept of reality can completely delude you. So begin again with seeing what happens if you're just generally aware of yourself and your surroundings without taking any idea whatsoever about it seriously. And using no words, you see? I'm using words, but for the time being you listen to my words as if they had no meaning, as if I were just making noises at you. And in this marvelous state of ignorance, there will be nothing called time, nothing called space, nothing called self, and nothing called other. There is just the happening. And it's not supposed to be anything particular. Whatever state of feeling you find yourself in, that is the way it's going. That's this. And you have no standards whereby to criticize it, to approve of it or disapprove of it. It's quite simply what there is. And sometimes it's delightful. I won't make a discipline out of it because that'll put you off. Sometimes it's delightful simply to sit. And because of our concepts, what makes this difficult to understand is that our minds are caught up in two questions. Why are we doing it? And what's the use of it? It's amazing how we are conditioned to turn everything into profit. And feel guilty if we're not. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to say to children. But we all have a kind of a conscience in us. I'll call it the commercial conscience, which is saying, in what way is this bettering your situation? If not financially, are you improving your mind? Are you becoming more spiritual? Whatever that is. And so we don't understand that any state that we could truly call meditation, or I prefer the word contemplation rather than meditation, you cannot be in that state for a purpose, or in a state of mind that is expecting a result to flow from it. Because the moment you do that, you are not in that state. You are bothering about concepts instead. This is, as it were, the one thing that, the one science, as it were, that has no goal in the sense of objective in the future. The stream begins in the mountains and runs down to the ocean. And we are apt to say the stream is moving to the ocean as its goal. But when it gets to the ocean, the water is again evaporated by the sun's heat and it returns to the mountains and it comes down again. Because the stream has no purpose to reach the ocean. Indeed, the stream is simultaneously in the sky, in the mountains, on its course, and in the ocean. It's in all places at once. And therefore it is not going anywhere. It is simply going. So when a Zen master was asked the question, "What is Tao?" he said, "Walk on." And really nothing will stop that. One cannot not walk on. The flow is there whether you resist it or whether you don't. And when you resist it, you're like somebody swimming against the current, which is a fast way to drown. And the skill of it, as in sailing, is to go intelligently with the current, steering it and using it. But it bothers us, especially Western industrial people, very much indeed, to consider a philosophy of no purpose. Because when we say of something, it has no future in it, that's equivalent to saying it's bad. But people use the word purpose and the word meaning in different ways. And often when we speak of a meaningless life or a purposeless life, in a negative, derogatory way, we are meaning actually a person who lives life for extremely short-term purposes. The same sort of restlessness that is encouraged in you by turning over the pages of such a magazine as Life. Now you realize that a magazine of that character is designed really to keep you away from any sort of serenity. No article in it is satisfactory in the sense of giving you anything to chew on. It ends too soon. It gives you just a flip here and a flip there. It never goes into anything deeply. It gives you a set of impressions. And you get pictures in it that are exciting or sensational or unusual, which momentarily entertain you, and you go through a whole issue and remember nothing. But it keeps you in a state of pacified agitation while you're flying on an airplane, waiting in an office, thumbing through something before breakfast, sort of thing. And this is the entire characteristic of a person who lives for short-term purposes. And that normally is what one would call the meaningless life. In contrast to that, a meaningful life is generally understood to be one devoted to long-term purposes. But, you know, what we call serious things. But the Taoist standpoint is neither of those. Because probably a Taoist will have thought through the question, what do I want? Very carefully. And have realized there's something spurious about most of our long-term purposes. Because when you think realistically and long-termishly about the state of human civilization, you see not much more than muddling through a mess. You will then say, well, what are we talking about then when we talk about a meaningful life? I think we should have a little bit more precision here than we usually do. In a very strict sense, words have meaning, and reality is meaning, and therefore has none. The word, the idea, which is a complex of words or other symbols, functions as a pointer to something other than itself. And that other is its meaning. So when you ask the question, what do trees and rivers mean? The answer is they don't, because they're not words, because they're not signs. Unless you say a river is a sign of rain. It's a kind of redundant statement, because a river is rain draining off the earth. So a river, the splendor of the river is that it is the meaning and has none. And therefore there is a quality of meaninglessness, of having no meaning, and yet of being meaning to all nature. Wittgenstein makes the remark that it is curious that when, after long questing, there are people who feel that they understand the sense of life, nevertheless they cannot say wherein that sense consists. I experience something, some human being, or some quality of light, or tree, or flower, or work of art, that I find is important. And I might use the word, it has tremendous meaning for me. And yet, when asked what that is, I am at a loss for words. Because actually, in a very high sense, nature is nonsense. And in this way also, music is nonsense, especially classical music. Whether it be the classical music of the West or the classical music of India or China. Because all classical music is non-representative, non-symbolic. It does not represent anything other than itself. It is patterning of sound. And it is like ferns, which are vegetable patternings, like crystals, which are chemical patternings, and like animals, you see, with their marvelous routines. And when we look at the routines of the animals and the plants, we, with our purposive minds, say, all this is for the purpose of survival. Now, for the survival of what? We have already defined the entire organism in terms of a purpose for survival. All the parts of a plant are shown to have roles in the survival process. So the survival process has as its fundamental purpose the continuation of the survival process. We, with our purposive minds, say, all this is for the purpose of survival. Now, for the survival of what? We have already defined the entire organism in terms of a purpose for survival. All the parts of a plant are shown to have roles in the survival process. So the survival process has as its fundamental purpose the continuation of the survival process. And nothing has been said. It's purely tautological. We're going on so as to go on. And this is a purely, I would call it an engineering approach to nature, where the engineer looks at a situation in the standpoint of efficiency. And has no raison d'etre in his thinking for inefficient processes. So therefore, if I would be going from here to there, the engineer wants me to go in the shortest possible distance and the quickest possible time, and will take a straight route rather than a wiggly one. And one goes wiggly, however, not merely to say fit better to the contours of the land, but to enjoy wiggling. Enjoyment of wiggling is really fundamental to life. It isn't wiggly just because that's the easiest way for it to be. It is wiggly for the pure love of wiggling. Why do we wear shirts like you're wearing, covered with interesting floral wiggles? Somehow those wiggles please the eye and are restful, whereas plain surfaces and straight lines are not always restful unless very skillfully handled, because they make the eye go dum, dum, see? Whereas in a floral setting, the eye can wander. Of course, let's overdo it like Victorian wallpaper, because that kills everything with too much of it. The Japanese do it so skillfully by using the emptiness and displaying against this a very clear wiggle, as in a flower arrangement or a calligraphic painting. Vanishingly soon you seem to arrive. If you go out in a hurry, it'll take forever to get there. So what is, to understand the Chinese and Japanese appreciation of natural form, which they derive essentially from Taoism, secondarily from Zen, because Zen is Buddhism as influenced by Taoism, you find increasingly that what characterizes their whole approach to art is the purposelessness of nature. In other forms of religious art, you find very symbolic style figures, paintings, sculpture. And these figures are normally symmetrical. But what you find in the Taoist and the Zen feeling for nature is that the focal point of reverence, of fascination, will be the unsymmetrical. It could be simply a rock of peculiar shape that has been set in space in a certain way. The rock, the bamboo, etc., is not intended to have any symbolic meaning whatsoever. It's the same likewise with the Zen stories. When somebody asks what is the fundamental meaning of Buddhism, and the master says, I didn't feel like wearing shoes today, I know very well that ignorant Chinese people will look for symbolism in this and will explain it by some sort of allegorical performance. But that is not the meaning of it at all. This is not the sense of a Zen remark. You cannot understand the sense of the Zen remark without being rather stupid. That is to say, taking it simply for what it is. He wasn't talking about not wearing any shoes. To lead you round through a kind of symbol that is a code known only to the initiates, there would be no point in such a thing. But simply talking quite directly. That's the reason. That is the fundamental meaning of Buddhism. Because the fundamental meaning is again the Tao. And I've shown you what the Tao is. The happening. Get with it. How can you not? So those works of art give the feeling. So supposing such a favorite scene is painted as a mountain landscape, and somewhere in it tiny little human figures. It's a poet wandering along through pine trees beside a stream. Where is he going? Where is the stream going? Where are the clouds going? Where are the birds going? We don't know, really. They are wandering on. And so you get the quality which the Japanese call yugen. Yugen is made of two characters which mean mysterious and deep. But a Japanese dramatist, Soami, said, now yugen is when you are watching wild geese and they are suddenly hidden by a cloud. When you are looking at ships far out to sea and they are hidden by a far-off island. Yugen is to wander on and on in a great forest without thought of return. Now, in these poetic expressions, you get a feel of a certain kind. I got plenty of nothing, and nothing is plenty for me. See, this is the same sort of thing. Another Chinese poem starts out, my thoughts will wander in the great void. This is yugen. Yugen, therefore, is the sensation of life, of nature, going but going nowhere. But it's not the sort of nowhere that we imagine when we see a sign which says no through road, or when we come to what we call a blank wall. Going nowhere is going into pregnant space, where we do not know, as it were, what will come of it. It's when space is used to let your imagination flow into it without being specific. When a certain kind of music hints at something, but never spoils its subtlety by explaining it. It is for the same reason that a joke is funny when a joke is not explained. and you do not even explain to yourself why you laugh, because that would spoil it. And so in the same way, there is this mysterious, which is not defined, but which you understand and see the beauty of it, just as you see the humor of the joke, without defining it. And that is why, incidentally, there is no adequate philosophy of humor, and certainly no funny philosophy of humor. A lot of philosophers and psychologists have written about the psychology of laughter in an extremely boring way. And in a way, it is as futile to discuss aesthetics in a kind of philosophical way as if we were trying to find out the formula for creating the beautiful object. But the poets, the Japanese and Chinese, repeatedly bring up images which evoke the marvel of purposelessness. Now let me give you an illustration. In Japan and in China, they love building temples on the sides of mountains. And especially forested mountains. In Japan, you will get a tree very like the sequoia. It's called a cryptomeria. And there are vast cathedral-like forests on the sides of mountains. Well, you'll see a great gate at the bottom of the mountain, and all kinds of ornate carvings in the gate, because it's in the ancient Tang Dynasty Chinese style, which is the style of Japanese temple architecture. And there are clouds and dragons and Apsara girls and all sorts of wonders in this gate. And you go through, and there's a grand set of stone steps flanked by guardian dogs and bronze lanterns, going up, up, up. Marvelous approach. And at the top of it is another such gate with maybe great sliding doors in it. And you go beyond that, and there is a courtyard surrounded with maple trees in front of the cryptomerias. And there is the temple. Splendid, great building. You go inside, and there is a marvelous golden altar with Buddhas and incense and golden lotus flowers and candles, and very, very splendid. There's Buddha sitting on his lotus throne, smiling down at you. Well, after that, somehow or other, these things are all rigged so that you find yourself behind the temple, and lo and behold, there's another flight of steps going up, not perhaps quite so grand. And you go up and up and up and up, and at last, a different kind of temple confronts you. This may be a Shinto temple. And this will be very simple in construction. Or it might be the hermitage, the personal house of the chief priest. The gate to this is more rustic, and there may be a small garden round it, leading you to a further ascent of steps beyond. And you go up and up and up once again. And here is a graveyard. They don't have sort of ugly tombstones like we do. They have simply square pillars with the name of the deceased written on in Chinese characters. Sometimes they're wooden. And there's this sense of the graveyard. Somehow it's not quite as depressing, because somehow the graveyard simply says, it all flows away. And right at the back of the graveyard, there's another shrine. And you get to that. And what is in it, in the place of honor? A mirror. And then, oh my goodness, there's still another flight going up. Just very crude, small steps going yet higher into the trees. And suddenly, the trail vanishes into the bushes. And a haiku poem says, "This is all there is. The path comes to an end among the parsley." And don't you remember that as a child? Of exploring around somebody's garden, and there are all sorts of, well, you look at things, you see, from them low down, and you don't look over the top of everything like an adult does. And so you explore little ways that go round and through bushes. And here's a trail, and finally it just vanishes into, it might very well be parsley. And I so vividly remember that, how magical that was. I felt I could disappear at that point and never be discovered. That there were all sorts of secrets hidden in those bushes. I never specified what they were. That was the whole point. We cannot conceive the real thing that we want. It would spoil it to do it, because then it would become a mere conception. What we're looking for is the great surprise, you see? And to the degree that we preconceive it, it'll fall flat. The whole principle of the universe, you see, in ordinary logic. But when we say of something that it happens necessarily, we are separating this happening from a cause. And that is a purely conceptual separation. Strictly speaking, everything that happens is part of the same event as its cause. Like I was showing you that the river is all one event. You can't say that a river is caused by its source. And if it wasn't flowing, there'd be no water in the ocean to pick up, sort of thing. And so you can get to a point where you understand that it's only, you look at your behavior, at the Tao from one point of view, and you can see it's free. That is to say, it is emerging now from the void. Quite freely, quite spontaneously. Look at it from another point of view, and you can see that everything that happens, happens necessarily. Actually, the truth is neither one nor the other. These are just different ways of classifying, ways of looking at it. It's like what you call in mathematics finding a limit. That is to say, if I have a magnet, has North Pole and South Pole, and I start at the North Pole, chopping, cut off sections, approaching the South Pole. At every point that I cut off a piece, I will have a North Pole. It will still be north, all the way until I get right to the end when the whole magnet has been chopped up and it disappears. Okay, let's do the other way. I begin from the South Pole. Every time I chop, getting closer to the north, the piece left is still south. That's the idea of a limit. So in the same way, if you approach the world from the end called necessity, and you start chopping to get to the end called freedom, it will always be necessity if you approach it that way, and you'll see everything is happening necessarily. Then if you turn it round and begin at the end called freedom, it'll always be freedom until you get to necessity and the thing disappears. For this reason now, then, the poet who speaks next to the musician most eloquently about Tao doesn't philosophize. The poet merely gives the image. This is all there is. The path comes to an end in the parsley.